Story number 1.
The House That Called Me Back. Cassie had spent her childhood summers at her grandmother's house in the countryside. It was an old, sprawling Victorian with creaky floors, hidden alcoves, and a sense of faded grandeur. When her grandmother passed away, the house had been left to her family, but they never sold it. Instead, it sat abandoned for years, slowly decaying. Cassie hadn't thought about the house in ages, but one night, she dreamed of it. In the dream, she was standing in the overgrown garden staring up at the windows. A figure stood there silhouetted in the flickering light of a candle. She couldn't see its face, but she felt it watching her. When she woke up, the memory of the dream lingered, vivid and unsettling. And then she got the call. Her mother's voice was tight on the other end of the line. The neighbors near Grandma's house called. They've been hearing strange noises at night. You know how small towns are, they think it's vandals, but I don't know, it might be worth checking out. Cassie didn't want to go. The house had always felt a little too alive, even when she was a child. But she agreed. She arrived late in the afternoon. The house loomed over her, its once bright paint now peeling and faded. The windows were dark, like empty eyes. As she approached, the front door creaked open on its own. Cassie hesitated on the threshold. The air inside was thick, heavy with the scent of mildew and something else, something metallic, like rust. She stepped in, her footsteps echoing in the vast empty space. The house was just as she remembered it. The grand staircase, the dusty chandeliers, the faded wallpaper. But it was wrong somehow. The shadows seemed deeper, shifting unnaturally when she wasn't looking directly at them. And then she heard it. A soft, distant humming. The sound was coming from the parlor where her grandmother used to knit by the fire. Cassie followed it, her heart pounding. When she reached the room, it was empty. But the old rocking chair was moving, creaking back and forth as if someone had just left it. On the floor she saw something that made her blood run cold. A single knitting needle, lying in a pool of red yarn. Except it wasn't yarn. Cassie backed out of the room, her chest tightening. The humming started again, louder this time, and she realized it wasn't coming from the parlor anymore. It was coming from upstairs. She didn't want to go, but her feet carried her to the staircase. Each step groaned under her weight, the sound echoing through the silent house. At the top of the stairs she paused. The hallway stretched before her, lined with closed doors. At the end was her grandmother's bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, a faint golden light spilling out. "Grandma?" Cassie whispered, her voice barely audible. The humming stopped. The door creaked open as she approached. The room was just as she remembered it, down to the floral bedspread and the photographs on the dresser. But the bed was empty, the covers pulled back as if someone had just risen. And in the corner, the wardrobe door stood open, revealing only darkness inside. Cassie stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat. The darkness in the wardrobe seemed to pulse, growing denser, more solid. And then, a hand reached out. It was pale, skeletal, the fingers impossibly long. Cassie stumbled back, a scream caught in her throat. The hand was followed by an arm, then a face she recognized. It was her grandmother. But her eyes were gone, replaced by black, empty voids. Her mouth twisted into a smile that was too wide, too sharp. "Why did you leave me?" The thing that looked like her grandmother rasped, its voice echoing unnaturally. Cassie turned and ran, her feet barely touching the stairs as she flew down them. She didn't stop until she was outside, gasping for air. When she looked back at the house, the lights in every window flared to life. And in each one, she saw her grandmother's face, staring at her, that terrible smile frozen in place. The house seemed to hum, a low, menacing vibration that resonated in her bones. Cassie didn't look back again. She never told anyone what happened that night. The house still stands, abandoned and rotting. But sometimes, when Cassie dreams, she's back there. And her grandmother is waiting.
Story number 2.
The Man in the Well. Lila grew up in a small, quiet town surrounded by dense woods. At the edge of her backyard stood an old, crumbling well, covered by a rusted iron grate. Her parents warned her to stay away from it. "It's dangerous," her father said. "You could fall in." But Lila wasn't afraid of the well. She was fascinated by it. As a child, she'd often sit nearby, tossing pebbles through the grate and listening to them clink against the walls before disappearing into the darkness below. She never heard them hit the bottom. It wasn't until she was 12 that she realized the well wasn't just deep. It was something else entirely. One summer evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Lila sat by the well, humming softly to herself. She dropped another pebble through the grate and waited, listening for the sound. Instead of a clink, she heard something else. A voice. "Hello?" it called, faint and raspy, echoing up from the darkness. Lila froze, her heart racing. "Who's there?" she whispered, leaning closer. For a moment there was silence. Then the voice came again. "Help me." Lila ran to the house, breathless and panicked. "There's someone in the well," she cried to her parents. Her father grabbed a flashlight and followed her outside, his expression skeptical. He shone the beam into the well, but the light only illuminated the first few feet of crumbling brick before fading into black. "Hello?" he called. His voice echoed back. There was no response. "It's just your imagination," he said, ruffling her hair. But Lila knew what she'd heard. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The voice had sounded desperate, human. It hadn't been her imagination. Unable to shake the feeling, she crept out of bed and tiptoed back to the well, armed with a flashlight and a rope she'd found in the garage. "Hello?" she whispered into the darkness. This time the voice answered immediately. "Please, help me. I'm so cold." The flashlight's beam barely penetrated the inky blackness, but Lila was determined. She tied the rope to a nearby tree, secured it around her waist, and climbed over the grate, lowering herself into the well. The air grew colder as she descended, damp and suffocating. "Keep coming," the voice urged, louder now, more distinct. The walls of the well were slimy, and the light from her flashlight flickered. About 20 feet down, she stopped. The darkness below seemed endless, but she could feel something. An almost imperceptible pull, like the well was drawing her in. "Where are you?" she called, her voice trembling. "Here," the voice said directly below her. She shone the flashlight down and screamed. A face stared back at her, pale and distorted, its eyes impossibly wide. Its mouth stretched into a grin that was too large for its face. The thing wasn't clinging to the walls or sitting at the bottom. It was floating, suspended in the air, staring straight at her. "You came," it said, its voice no longer faint. It was loud and guttural, echoing around the walls. Lila scrambled to climb back up, her hands slipping on the rope. The thing began to rise, its grin widening. "You can't leave," it hissed. The rope felt heavier, as if something was pulling her down. Lila screamed for her parents, her voice hoarse with terror. Just as she felt the rope slacken, strong hands grabbed her from above. Her father hauled her out of the well, pulling her onto the grass. "Lila!" he shouted, shaking her. "What were you thinking?" She pointed to the well, sobbing. "It's down there! It's in the well!" Her father shone the flashlight down again, but there was nothing. "See?" he said, his voice softening. "There's nothing there." But Lila couldn't stop shaking. The next morning, her parents sealed the well, covering it with concrete. Lila never went near it again. But sometimes, late at night, when the house was quiet, she swore she could still hear it. A faint, raspy voice carried on the wind, calling her name. "Lila!"
Story number 3.
The room no one could enter. When Claire started her job as a housekeeper at the old Langford estate, she was given clear instructions. Clean all the rooms, except the one at the end of the third-floor corridor. "Don't go near it," Mrs. Whitaker, the head housekeeper, warned. "Don't touch the door, don't even look at it." Claire thought the rule was odd, but she needed the job. She nodded and promised to follow instructions. The Langford estate was massive. with its labyrinth of hallways and antique furniture that seemed to breathe with the house. But no matter where Claire was in the mansion, she couldn't stop thinking about the forbidden room. It wasn't hard to find. On her first day working alone, curiosity got the better of her. She ventured to the 3rd floor and stood at the end of the corridor. The door was unremarkable, plain wood, no ornate carvings like the others in the house, but something about it felt wrong. The air was colder there and the silence was oppressive. Claire swore she heard faint whispers, just at the edge of hearing, coming from the other side of the door. Shaking her head, she walked away. Days turned into weeks, but the room seemed to call to her. Once, while dusting the nearby hallway, she heard a faint knock. She froze, her duster in midair. The knock came again, slow and deliberate. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. No answer. Claire told herself it was her imagination, but the unease lingered. One night, she stayed late to finish cleaning the dining room. As she was packing up to leave, the lights flickered, and the mansion plunged into darkness. Grabbing her flashlight, she made her way through the house. When she reached the 3rd floor, she heard it again. A faint knock. This time, it was followed by a voice. "Please. Help me." The words were barely audible, but they sent chills down her spine. She should have walked away. Instead, she moved closer. Claire stood before the door, her hand hovering over the knob. The voice came again, louder now, more desperate. "Help me! Please!" Her heart raced as she grasped the cold metal. She hesitated, her mind screaming at her to stop. But the voice sounded so human, so pained. She turned the knob. The door creaked open, revealing a room bathed in darkness. The air was freezing and the faint smell of decay hit her nose. "Hello?" she whispered, stepping inside. The door slammed shut behind her. Claire spun around, her flashlight beam darting across the room. The walls were lined with cracked, peeling wallpaper. A single chair sat in the center, its back turned to her. And then she noticed the shadows. They were wrong. Too long. Too twisted. They stretched across the room, writhing as if alive. The whispers grew louder, surrounding her, echoing from every corner. "Why did you come?" one voice hissed. "She shouldn't be here," another murmured. Claire's breathing quickened as the shadows coalesced, forming a figure behind the chair. The figure rose, its movements unnatural and jerky. It turned to face her, and Claire felt her blood run cold. The thing had no eyes, just empty sockets that seemed to drink in the light. Its mouth was a jagged, gaping hole that stretched across its face. "You shouldn't have opened the door," it rasped, its voice a chorus of whispers. Claire backed away, her flashlight flickering. I didn't mean to," she stammered. The figure moved closer, its limbs too long, its shadow stretching out to engulf her. "You can't leave now," it said. Claire screamed, fumbling for the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in as the whispers became deafening. Just as the shadow reached her, the door flew open and she stumbled out, landing hard on the hallway floor. The whispers stopped. When she looked back, the door was closed again, as if nothing had happened. Claire quit the next day. She never spoke of what she saw, but Mrs. Whitaker didn't ask. She simply nodded, her face grim. "You're not the first," she said quietly. "The Langford estate still stands, and the room at the end of the 3rd floor corridor remains untouched. But those who work there say that late at night you can hear faint knocks and whispers. And if you listen closely, the voice always says the same thing. 'Help me.'